Hello everybody! Today I'm going to show you how I turned 3 thrifted men's shirts into a dress. That's today on Refashioning with Rachel. First, I tried on the shirt that I wanted to use as a bodice and decided where I wanted my waist to be. I cut along that line, adding a centimeter for seam allowance, and saved the bottom part for later. I cut off the sleeves and saved those for later. I folded the remaining bodice in half, carefully lining up the shoulder seams and side seams, and using a shirt that fit me well as a pattern, I folded that shirt in half the same way and put it on top of the bodice piece, lining up the shoulder seams and the back seam. Then I traced around my shirt, adding a centimeter for seam allowance. I couldn't exactly trace out the armholes onto the bodice, but that's okay since I am putting sleeves back in later. I just made it match up as well as I could. Then, with right sides facing, I pinned and sewed the side seams. Then I tried on the bodice and decided to add some darts, so I roughly pinned in where I wanted the darts to be. And then I sewed in the darts. And after trying it on again, I decided to take in the side seams. I cut the sleeves off the second shirt, cutting very carefully since these would be the sleeves that I would be attaching to the bodice. I made a tiny little notch to indicate where the shoulder seams would be. I made 2 more notches on the bodice, 2 inches down on either side from that shoulder notch. And then measuring from the bottom of the sleeve, I transferred those 2 notches onto the sleeve, leaving some excess fabric on the top of the sleeve. I did the same thing on the other side. Then I opened the bodice and reached through the armhole so that right sides were facing, and I pinned the underside of the sleeve to the side seam of the bodice. And working my way around the armhole, I found the notches and pinned them together. And as you can see, there's some excess fabric in the top of the sleeve, but you will see how I took that in when I sewed up the armhole. So beginning with the bottom of the armhole, I sewed the sleeve to the bodice, making sure the raw edges were lined up and using a centimeter for seam allowance. When I got to the top of the sleeve, I simply made a few little rough pleats to force the sleeve to fit into the armhole. And then I just finished sewing the armhole normally. And now you can see the sleeves are gathered at the shoulders. With the rest of the shirt that I used for the sleeves, I cut out as many 12-inch rectangles that I could get out of the fabric. Even though I unpicked the front pocket, I still didn't use that piece. But I got more 12-inch panels off of the back of the shirt and off of the other side of the shirt. These side seams were a little curved, so I cut them straight and re-sewed them. And I pinned and sewed all of the panels together, ending up with one big loop of fabric. I ironed all of those seams flat and turned that loop of fabric right side out. I cut in a little notch to to indicate where the front and the back and the two sides would be. On the bodice, I put a pin in the center front and a little notch on the back. In order to make the tier match up with the bodice, I made a gathering stitch on the top of the tier, which is the longest stitch possible on the sewing machine. And then I pulled on the top thread and slid the fabric down the thread to create these gathers. Once the tier was roughly the same width of the bodice, I pinned the tier to the bodice, matching up the little notches I made earlier. So I'm matching the front notch to the button placket, and the side notches to the side seams of the bodice, the back notch to the back notch, and the other side notch to the other side seam. And then I sewed it all together. Over by the sewing machine, I worked with 1/4 at a time, making sure the gathers were more evenly spaced apart, and using more pins to secure the gathers. I find that working with just 1/4 section at a time makes this process much easier. And I just continued sewing until the first tier was attached to the bodice. I unpicked the basting stitch. And now my first ruffled tier of the dress is attached. And then I moved on to the second tier. For the second tier of this dress, I went back to the first shirt that I used for the bodice. And I cut out as many 12-inch rectangles as I could squeeze onto the fabric. I cut open the sleeves so that I could cut out some more rectangles. And I repeated the same steps as with the first tier, pinning all sides of the rectangles together, making one big loop. I made a basting stitch around the top of that loop and gathered up the fabric. I made notches in both tiers indicating the front, back, and sides, and pinned the tiers together at those notches. And I sewed the bottom tier to the top tier, evening out the gathers as I went. In order to make this tier lie more nicely, I folded the seam toward the top tier and made a stitch close to the edge. For the last tier, I used my third shirt, which was a ladies' shirt, so I didn't have as much fabric to work with. I cut out all the 10-inch rectangles I could fit on the fabric. I even unpicked the pocket on the front so that I could use that fabric. In the end, I was able to squeeze out enough rectangles to make a nice big loop of fabric. I attached the third tier to the second tier the same way I did before. and made an edge stitch close to the seam. Earlier, I tried on the bodice and decided where I wanted the sleeves to end. I subtracted an inch from that measurement and cut the sleeves off. I cut 1.5 inches from the cuffs on the third shirt. And since that was a lady's shirt, the cuffs actually fit me well. I cleaned up the cut a little bit, and I pinned the cuff to the sleeve, first pinning each end of the cuff to each end of the sleeve. And then adding more pins and making some pleats in the sleeve to make the sleeve fit the cuff. And then I sewed the cuff to the sleeve. I made a zigzag stitch on the raw edge of this seam. I could have used my serger, but I wanted to show you that you don't necessarily need one. I cut off some straggly threads, and then pushing the seam toward the cuff, I top stitched close to the seam around the cuff to keep the seam in place. And now I have a fully functioning sleeve and cuff that is the length that I want. I hemmed the bottom of the dress simply by folding it over twice and securing it with a stitch. And then with all of the little scraps left over from the third shirt, I cut out as many 2-inch strips as I could until I had enough pieces that I could make a belt that was about 2 times the width of my waist. I sewed all of these pieces together end by end. I ironed those seams flat. I folded down and ironed 1 centimeter from the top of the strip. Then I folded up and ironed 1 centimeter from the bottom of the strip. And then I folded the whole thing in half and ironed that. At the sewing machine, I folded down the 1st centimeter of the strip, and then I sewed all along the side of the strip, starting at the end that has the double fold. When I got to the end of the strip, I folded up about 1 centimeter from the end. And pivoted and sewed the end. And then pivoted again and sewed all the way down the other side of the belt. And pivoted again at the other end to finish off the belt. I used some string to make some simple belt loops. I threaded it through a needle and put it through the dress at the side seams. Using something round to help me, I made a knot and cut off the excess thread. And now I have a simple belt loop. the last thing I did was to remove the collar. I simply unpicked it from the collar band and then sewed the collar band back together at the top. And then I was finished. So here's a reminder of how this project looked before. And this is how it looks now. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe if you did, and have a beautiful day.